Hey guys, Excoundrel here, welcome to the channel again. This time we're going to be looking at a specific composition in TFT and TFT Mobile called Cybernetic Blademaster. It's a really strong comp right now because Cybernetic's value is really high when you have a single item on them, and you can spread your items out across the Cybernetics quite easily. So I want to talk about items to begin with because items are a really good indication about what kind of build you will benefit from going. And right now with Cybernetics, if you're getting things like BF swords and recurve bows on the carousel, this is a pretty good indication that you're going to be set up well for going into a Cybernetic build. Items that are useful on your carries are things like Guardian Angel, things like Hand of Justice, things like Ginsu's Rageblade, and obviously the Infiltrator Spatula item. These obviously want to be spread out for the most part, but Irelia is your main cybernetic carry for the most part. Hand of Justice works really well on Lucian, but we will talk about itemization in the actual guide where we go through positioning and everything else. Other useful items are things like Ionic Spark, Spear of Shojin, Echo does really well with those, and Thief's Gloves, which gives you an item that can work well on both Fiora and Vi. Tank items for Leona are things like Bramble Vest and Zephyr. They're just useful items. Bramble Vest works really well with Leona, and Zephyr works really well in general. So again, those are just useful items that I think you should be considering when playing Cybernetics. Hey guys, what's going on? So we're going to talk a little bit about Cybernetics now. This is one of the more powerful compositions in the meta. I'm going to talk a little bit about what you're looking for when you want to go Cybernetics in the early game. Now obviously, you want to find a Fiora and a Leona. So Fiora and Leona are obviously fantastic. And then to really solidify a good early game Cybernetics build, you're going to obviously want Lucian. This gives you your 3 Cybernetics units. And then for your 4th unit, because obviously being at level 4, Graves is a good shout because he gives you the early blaster. And when you combine that with Lucian and Cybernetic, this is a really strong early 4 combo. And it's usually a good indication that going Cybernetics would be a good idea for you if you get a Fiora, a Leona, and a Lucian very early on. In terms of itemization, Lucian, you'll give a Hand of Justice to as soon as you get it. So if you get a Hand of Justice, just give it to Lucian. It's a really good item for him. 100% would recommend. Fiora doesn't desperately need items, but if you find a Thief's Gloves, then that's always good. And when it comes to itemization for Leona, I don't usually commit anything to her too early, but if I end up with something like a Bramble Vest, I'll give it to her. Or if I end up something like a Zephyr, I can hand it to her. Don't ever really stack more than one item on Leona. It's a waste of components. But these guys, this kind of forms your mid-game, or sorry, early to mid-game team. This will carry you through the early rounds, especially if you can 2-star your Fiora, 2-star Leona, and massively important 2-starring your Lucian. Graves can kind of be whatever. He's there primarily just to be an early game blaster, and this kind of gives you a good solid early game. When it comes to positioning, kind of you can have whatever you want in the front. It doesn't matter too much about positioning in the early game, but obviously you kind of want to keep Lucian in the middle, somewhere safe. You could put Graves at the back. If someone's got early infiltrators, you could have Graves at the back for a bit of bait, but honestly just having these guys at the front is always good. If you do find that you're facing a lot of infiltrators, you can go ahead and stick I've just dropped Fiora off the face of the planet. You can go ahead and stick Fiora at the back if you really want to, or Graves, but realistically, positioning doesn't matter too much. I do often like to have Leona in the middle, especially if I do have Bramble Vest, because it's more likely that she's going to have a lot of people around her. So you kind of put Leona in the middle to make sure she's crowded. But other than that, positioning is not too important in the early game. So as we get towards the mid-game, this often ends up being one of my more common mid-game compositions. You can replace Jinx for Ezreal. If you don't have the 4 costs, so you can very easily replace Jinx for Ezreal wherever he is. So you can replace Jinx for Ezreal, and you can replace Cho'Gath for either Blitzcrank if you want to have the Chrono and the Brawler. In fact, actually Blitzcrank's probably just the best choice here. You can replace him for Blitzcrank, and then you have those. But if you don't want to run these guys, you can actually just get rid of them, obviously. And you can run Cho'Gath if you have the economy to support it, and you can also run the Jinx, like I said. And that gives you the Cybernetic Brawler Blaster combo. Now, obviously, these are going to eventually go. So as you work towards getting towards your late game composition, let's say level 7, you're obviously then going to be looking for your Irelia, for instance. So obviously, when you get towards the late game, you're going to be looking for your full composition. Now, it can be a little bit hard to execute this composition 100%. So I actually quite like keeping Jinx in as a brawler, as a blaster. Obviously, if I find Miss Fortune, I would take Miss Fortune out for Jinx, but obviously it's quite difficult to find 2 legendaries. Your primary legendary that you're looking for is obviously going to be your Echo. This would be giving you pretty much your 6 cybernetic, and then you have your 2 blasters with Lucian and Jinx, and then you just need a final Blademaster. That Blademaster is best as Kayle. So Kayle is the best Blademaster in this scenario. So positioning wise, you always want your Misfortune or your Jinx in the back if you can help it, and obviously putting Lucian in the middle works out pretty nicely. Sorry, I've just taken off Hand of Justice to him, so I need to put that back on. So then the positioning kind of varies. It really depends on whether you can actually find the Infiltrator item for your Irelia. That's the most important. One of the key items for Irelia is going to be Guardian Angel. One of the key items for Kayle is going to end up being Ginsu's Rage Blade. Leona can do with Bramble Vest, or she works pretty well with Zephyr as a utility item. And then realistically, for Fiora and for Vi, they both work really well with Thief's Gloves. But realistically, what I mean by that is that essentially you just give them the scraps of whatever else is left on the cybernetic side of things. When it comes to Echo, you are really looking for a Ionic Spark, because that's a really, really good item in general, but also he works pretty well with, as you can see down here, Spear of Shojin. I really like Spear of Shojin on Echo as well, because he's got a really powerful ability. So I think all of this is kind of coming together as your final composition. Obviously, when you get to level 9, you can add whatever you want, a legendary or etc. But this is kind of like the best thing. You can replace Jinx for Misfortune. This kind of gives you your overall comp. If you don't get, I'm trying to find where the item actually is, the one that makes you an Infiltrator. Here we go, Infiltrator's talents. Okay, so there we go. If she has this, you can put her in the back, usually alongside. Sorry, that's wrong. That's the wrong person. You put her in the back, usually alongside Echo, like this, and then you can have your kind of other carries over here. So this is like a solid positioning set. You can have your Kayle here, you kind of spread them out at the back, and you kind of keep these guys at the front to be your tanks. If you do not have this, you can essentially just put Irelia up at the front, and she will just act as another frontliner, and then you kind of put Echo there, and you just split these guys out across the back. Remember to be aware of Blitzcrank positioning, whatever else you like, but this is kind of like the setup for the core Cybernetics composition, and that's from early to mid game to late game, and that's kind of the way I play it. I think it's really strong. It's a very, very good composition in general. So what I would say finally about this composition is that your carry is primarily Irelia. So if you need to add more items to Irelia, I would recommend things like Ginsu's Rage Blade, Bloodthirster, Infinity Edge, Seraphs, all of which are very good. And obviously you want to try and find the Infiltrator Blademaster item, or sorry, the Infiltrator Spatula item on her, because that allows her to jump to the backline and be a bit more deadly. The problem without that is that she has to get through the front line a lot of the time, but with the Infiltrator item, it makes her very deadly. So you could add an Infinity Edge on top or a Ginsu's on top, and she actually becomes an incredibly good carry. Although I would say that Kayle with Ginsu's is very strong as well, so it really just depends on what you feel like you want for your comp. So let's have a look at the early game start that we've got right now here. You can see that I found myself a Fiora, a Lucian, and a Leona, and I found myself a very early Hand of Justice for my Lucian. This is basically a perfect start for Cybernetics. The only thing that I'm going to be struggling with is that I don't actually have many 2-stars right now. In fact, I have none. So you can see there are a lot of builds like here. We've got a Graves and a Twisted Fate, both at 2-star, and my Lucian is absolutely just, crushing them in terms of sustain, but you can't beat the kind of level of 2-stars that this guy had. So very, very difficult to sustain here. But what I'm looking for right now is just trying to level up my Fiora, level up my Leona, buy any extra Lucians that I can find, just setting up for a mid game where I should have all of these guys up to 2-star. What we're going to look to do at level 4, in most cases, would be bring on a blaster like Ezreal, bring on a blaster like Graves, for instance. However, you can also think to bring on a Vanguard, which will make your Leona a bit more beefy, and you can also look to potentially bring on something like a just any 2-star. For instance, in this game, you're going to see that I bring on a 2-star Twisted Fate just because that's what I get at level 4, and essentially he just fills a gap in my composition that I can essentially sell later on. So you don't need to be too picky about what you bring in at sort of 2-star and at level 4 and level 5, because you're not always going to find the perfect unit, and sometimes just 2 stars in the early game are more powerful than actually completing some early synergies. When it comes to delivering items to your cybernetics, because obviously to make the cybernetics buff work, you do need to deliver items to them, I would recommend that obviously Hand of Justice on Lucian is pretty good, but any kind of attack damage item is always going to be good on Lucian. I would recommend any good tank items, so if you have something like a chain vest, you can just give that to your Leona. If you have something like Brawler's Gloves, you can throw that on your Fiora. You want to make sure that whatever item or whatever component you're giving to your Leona or your Fiora, you are willing to combine that into something useful later on, if you're going to combine it at all. Remember, it can be very difficult to commit an item to a TFT piece and then have to sell it later on, and you don't find that unit back, especially if you're in the late game. It is more difficult to find things like 1 and 2 costs, so you do have to make sure that when you do commit an item to Leona or Fiora, you're pretty confident that either you're going to find another 2-star Fiora or Leona to make up for it, or you're willing to combine whatever component that you put on them to make some kind of item that will be useful for them. For instance, I talked about it in the game earlier. Leona works with any kind of tank items, but things like Bramble Vest and Zephyr, or Ionic Spark is even perfectly fine. Or, things like Fiora, she will do well with things like a Bloodthirster or a Gwynsu's. She's fine with Thief's Gloves, which are optimal for her because then you don't have to commit anything else. But there's lots and lots of different items that you can consider. But for the most part, just be willing to commit whatever component that you throw on them, be willing to commit that item. So we're getting here towards the mid game. We're now at level 5. You can see that we've still got the Twisted Fate on, but I have added the Ezreal to give myself a Blaster alongside the Lucian, and I've obviously got the Jace to give myself a Vanguard with the Leona, and I've got that random 2-star Twisted Fate, 2-star Twisted Fate on the field as well. So this is just like a sort of I guess a hybrid Frankenstein mid-game. When you're around level 6, you are looking to just utilize other synergies where you can. So things like Vanguard are good. Things like Chrono is good. You can see here I've got Twisted Fate and Ezreal giving me the Chrono buff. Blaster is fantastic. You definitely want to make sure you try and find Blaster right now. And these are all like, even Brawler if you find Vi. So if you've got Vi in this composition, you can add Brawler. So you can add like a Cho'Gath and a Vi over anything else. You can see Cho'Gath on the screen right there, but I opted to keep the Ezreal and the Twisted Fate to have the Chrono in this mid game. We're going to now move over to some later stages of the games. Now we are looking at around level 7, and you can see that I have got 5 out of 6 cybernetics. I'm obviously looking for Echo. I do not like to roll for a legendary unless I'm desperate at level 7, because the chances of finding a legendary at level 7 are just 1%. So I usually like to wait till level 8 until I start doing any kind of fancy rolling for a legendary. But what you can see here is I'm working with Blademasters. I've got 3 of them, and I've got 2 blasters as well. So I've got Jinx as my blaster, like I talked about in the build. My Blademasters are the Fiora, the Irelia, and I also now have a Kayle, so I've added a Kayle to the mix. The reason we like to add Misfortune over Jinx later on is that you get the Valkyrie buff, which is obviously a really, really strong buff. Something else that you could add for Valkyrie is potentially a Kai'Sa. So Kai'Sa acts as an infiltrator, and that will work well with your Echo and your Irelia, because remember, if you don't find the infiltrator buff, then, or if you don't find the infiltrator item, then obviously your Echo is going to be less effective. So you want to find a infiltrator that works for you, and I think Kai'Sa is just the best addition over anything else, because it activates the Valkyrie buff for your your Kayle. And you can see here in the late game now, I've positioned a little bit weirdly. That's because I do have a Zeke's Herald on my Vi just to give her an item. That's just buffing the attack speed of some of my important carries, like the Kayle, like the Fiora, the Irelia, and the Lucian. And you can see we're in a pretty good spot right now. We also do have that Misfortune on the sidelines, so we've got that. We've got that Blaster buff going on. Or rather, we've got the Blaster and also the Valkyrie buff going on. We are losing to a couple of guys here and there, but we obviously are waiting to find some important 3-stars like the Vi. We also need to find, a potential 2-star Echo or a 2-star Misfortune would be really strong. There are a lot of things that we can search for that could potentially buff the overall damage capabilities of this team, and you can see the Vi here. I'm actually pretty low HP at 14, so I choose to sell the Misfortune, and then we get that 3-star Vi, which actually is going to give us a pretty solid buff overall in terms of damage output. But I do want to keep that Zeke's on some of my more important carries in the backline here, which is why I'm doing what I'm doing in terms of positioning. However, you know, you can see we're worked into a top 3 scenario with this build. We just need to get one more guy knocked out, and we're going for top 2. What I will say about this game is I ended up coming second. You'll see me knock out this guy right at the very end here, but for the most part, I actually ended up losing to a guy playing Mech Infiltrator, which is another very, very good build, which I'm going to start to talk about in another video. But this is just a solid build all around, and you can see, like, it will usually get you a top 3 place. This is a build that, because it's all static stats, unfortunately, it sometimes has problems scaling, but it will usually find you a top 3 spot, which is a really, really good thing about this build in general. Alright guys, thank you very much. Stick around, I'll be doing more guides on the channel looking at meta builds. I'll also be doing some playthroughs. TFT Mobile releasing was a big deal for me, and I hope you guys enjoy it. I know the TFT beta has had some issues. I know some people have complained about the way it looks, but I think, you know, they are still working on it, and I expect Riot to improve on it, because Riot do have a big commitment to TFT as a product, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what they do with it in the future. Alright guys, see you soon.